Before we get started, a quick heads up. Presidents Unplugged now has merch. If you want to support the show and represent the podcast in your daily life, you can at presidentsunpluggedmerch.com. That is presidentsunpluggedmerch.com. Now, let's get into today's episode. Just after midnight on June 17, 1972, at the Watergate complex in Washington, D.C., a young security guard named Frank Wills is making his rounds when he notices tape covering the latch on a door. The tape kept the door from locking. He removes the tape, doesn't think much about it, but later he comes back and finds the door taped again. Now something feels wrong. Wills calls the police, and 5 men are arrested inside the offices of the Democratic National Committee headquarters. Nobody knows it yet, but that little strip of tape is the small loose thread that will eventually unravel an entire American presidency. This is the story of the Watergate scandal. Let's do this. Watergate is known as one of America's largest scandals. But why? It was just a burglary. That's all it was. But the burglary itself is just the beginning of a long, long story. The real question is what happened after the break-in, and what people in power were willing to do to keep the real truth hidden. To understand Richard Nixon, the president overseeing it all, we need to go back 12 years beforehand to 1960. Richard Nixon, then vice president, ran against the young, stylish John F. Kennedy. Nixon was an experienced politician, but Kennedy understood the new age of television, having a style and an attitude that made him likable to the American people. Nixon looked tired during their famous first-ever televised presidential debates, while Kennedy looked calm, young, and polished. Historians still debate how much television changed that election, but Nixon came away understanding that image mattered enormously. What do people really think of me? That defeat in 1960 stayed right with Nixon until 8 years later when he came back. America in 1968 was completely different than America in 1960. The country was divided by the Vietnam War, protests, and the assassinations of Martin Luther King and Robert F. Kennedy only 2 months apart. 1968 was a chaotic time. RFK, who had been assassinated in June, was the Democratic candidate before his assassination completely reshaped the race. Nixon, in the midst of all this chaos, presented himself as an experienced candidate who could restore order to the divided country. And he won. Once in office, Nixon proved that his presidency was much more than the Watergate scandal that we know so well. Especially during his first term, Nixon achieved major accomplishments. He opened relations with Communist China. He pursued détente with the Soviet Union. Détente is a French word describing peaceful relations between countries. And his entire administration saw the creation of the Environmental Protection Agency, or the EPA. If you want the larger story of Nixon's presidency outside of the Watergate scandal, make sure to check out our Season 1 episode number 37, Rise, Fall, Resignation, More Than a Scandal. While I skim over the scandal in my first episode, because Nixon is more than a scandal, let's get back to the scandal. Nixon was extremely effective, especially in foreign affairs. But Nixon was also suspicious. He was very protective of his image, and he was increasingly worried about political enemies and leaks. Leaking classified documents that could completely change the way people see the government. In 1971, the Pentagon Papers exposed hidden details about America's decision-making process in the Vietnam War. These leaks would have concerned earlier administrations. They would have concerned a Kennedy or a Johnson. But Nixon's White House became obsessed with stopping these leaks. After these issues, a secret unit was created to stop them. Come on, they gotta have a good name for this secret unit. They were called the Plumbers because they were supposed to plug leaks. Very creative, Richard Nixon. This culture of secrecy became an important bridge to what would become the Watergate scandal. So let's go back to June of 1972. These 5 burglars are caught inside Democratic headquarters, and they were found to be connected to a political intelligence operation. This was not some random political group that are just trying to be sneaky little burglars. These men were eventually linked to Nixon's re-election campaign. They were trying to photograph documents and work with listening devices, trying to bug the phones and listen to what the Democrats are talking about. But here's the issue. For being 5 criminals trying to get secret data, maybe for the president, the operation wasn't super calculated or hidden. It was remarkably lackadaisical. Lackadaisical is the word of the day. Lackadaisical means lacking enthusiasm or determination, being carelessly lazy. These lackadaisical criminals were taping the doors. They were making mistakes and behaved nothing like flawless movie spies that were working for the president. We still don't know if they're realistically connected to Nixon at this point. But here's where the issue arises. The Watergate break-in wasn't that big of a deal. The break-in itself was almost small enough to disappear. Oh gosh, 5 men broke into the Democratic headquarters. The world keeps turning and people forget about it in 3 days. But people started to get more and more suspicious. The burglary was small enough to be forgotten. The cover-up was not. Investigators began following the money that was connected to the burglars. At one point during the break-in, somebody had a roll of $100 bills, which investigators, studying the serial numbers, followed a trail. That path led directly towards Nixon's re-election organization, the Committee for the Re-election of the President, commonly mocked with their very unfortunate acronym, CREEP. Suddenly, these weren't just a bunch of random guys in a random office. At the Washington Post, 2 men named Bob Woodward and Carl Bernstein kept digging, while many Americans still saw Watergate as a strange little burglary. So why did these 2 random guys take up one of the largest political scandal investigations in American history? Well, working at the Washington Post gave them legitimate interest in the issue, and they also had another confidential source, a man who became known as Deep Throat. Deep Throat was an anonymous man that didn't hand them the entire scandal. He confirmed information, he provided some context, and he warned Woodward when the investigation was heading somewhere important. The identity of this secret man named Deep Throat would remain one of Watergate's great mysteries for more than 3 decades. While all of these investigations are happening, Nixon had something a little bit more important to do: run for re-election. Nixon was a very popular candidate in 1972 and won an enormous landslide over Democrat George McGovern. And I'm not talking about a landslide, he won 3 more states than McGovern. Oh no. Nixon won 49 states to McGovern's 1. McGovern only won Massachusetts. That's it. The contrast of this story is incredible. Questions about Watergate were growing while Nixon was being reelected by 49 states to 1. Nixon was going to be back in the White House for 4 more years, and he was unbelievably popular. What in the world does he have to lose? Well, that didn't take very long. In 1973, right after Nixon was back in the Oval Office, excited for his next term, Senate hearings brought this scandal that was swept under the rug directly into American homes. In the 70s, people couldn't stream Netflix or just watch TV and scroll through endless channels. I really don't remember this, maybe because I'm not 50 or more years old, but during that time, there was only a handful of major television networks. So nationally televised Senate hearings on 6 of the 12 channels on the TV were hard to ignore. Witnesses in these hearings described spying, secret payments, and attempts to contain the Watergate investigation so that the info doesn't get out to the public. Senator Howard Baker gave Watergate its defining question, asking, what did the president know, and when did he know it? If all of this was going on behind Nixon's back, or if his sneaky, corrupt buddies were trying to do things without his knowledge, because if Nixon wasn't really involved, we can just fire the bad guys and keep the president in the White House. That'd just be great. But then came a revelation that changed everything. During one of the Senate hearings, a man named Alexander Butterfield casually mentioned something that was really important: a taping system inside of the White House. Beginning in 1971, many presidential conversations were automatically recorded, including in the Oval Office. The irony of this statement is that Nixon added this recording system for record keeping, making sure that if somebody said he said something, he could prove it and say, hey, I didn't say a word. In a very ironic turn of events, investigators finally realized that the answer to what Nixon knew and when he knew it might literally be sitting on a tape in the White House. These recordings also exposed a more private Nixon who sounded a little bit rougher, a little bit more suspicious, and a little bit more politically corrupt than the man that Americans elected by a 49-state landslide the year before. The fight over Watergate became a fight over the tapes. Nixon argued that presidential conversations deserved to be confidential under executive privilege. Presidents do need confidential space, but Congress, prosecutors, and the courts increasingly questioned whether that executive privilege could protect evidence. The constitutional walls were closing in on Nixon. Then came the Saturday Night Massacre in October of 1973. And no, the Saturday Night Massacre is not an episode of Saturday Night Live gone horribly wrong. The Saturday Night Massacre was when Special Prosecutor Archibald Cox, multiple great names in this episode, wanted these tapes. Nixon ordered Attorney General Elliot Richardson to fire him. He wants these tapes. I want him gone. Richardson refused the president and resigned his position as Attorney General. Richardson's deputy also refused to fire Cox, and eventually, Solicitor General Robert Bork carried out Nixon's order and dismissed Cox. It's a little suspicious to get rid of the guy that is saying, "Can we just see the tapes? Can we at least hear what you said?" Think about how far we've traveled in this story. A security guard found tape on a door, and now the Justice Department officials were leaving their jobs during a confrontation with the president. To defend himself in such an intense scandal, Richard Nixon was going to have to travel to the most magical place on earth. Abraham Lincoln was 6'4". Franklin Roosevelt was the president for over 4,000 days. These are facts. But you know what else is a fact? The fact that Presidents Unplugged has an Instagram page. If you want presidential content and overall updates on the show, come to the Instagram at presidents_unplugged. That is presidents_unplugged. I'll see you there. On November 17th, 1973, Richard Nixon traveled to Walt Disney World in Florida. But he wasn't there to ride Space Mountain or eat a pretzel shaped like Mickey Mouse. He was there to defend his case. In a press conference at a Walt Disney World resort, Nixon said these now famous words.
I want to say this to the television audience. I made my mistakes, but in all of my years of public life, I have never profited from public service. I've earned every cent. And in all of my years of public life, I have never obstructed justice. And I think, too, that I can say that in my years of public life, that I welcome this kind of examination, because people have got to know whether or not their president's a crook. Well, I'm not a crook. I've earned everything I've got.
Nixon was trying to convince the entire country that he was not a criminal, but the pressure kept building. Watergate began almost 2 years ago with tape on a door latch. Now it was coming down to tapes inside the White House. And in July of 1974, the Supreme Court unanimously ruled in the case United States v. Nixon, maybe the country shouldn't have to fight its president in a court case, but I digress. In this case, they ruled that the president had to surrender the requested recordings. Executive privilege was not unlimited when evidence was needed in a criminal case. This was checks and balances used in the real world. The first 3 articles of the Constitution create Congress, the presidency, and the Justice Department to each be powerful in their own ways, but also limited. Watergate became a stress test of the very design of the Constitution. What was our country going to do if Nixon truly was affiliated to the Watergate break-in, and more importantly, the cover-up? Problems began to arise when Congress found what is now called the smoking gun tape. Okay, somebody shot the gun of this break-in. Who in the world shot the gun? Oh, Nixon's holding the gun with smoke still coming out of it. He must have shot the bullet. Even though there wasn't direct evidence that Nixon was a part of the creation of the Watergate break-ins, he was holding the smoking gun. The recording was of Nixon and Chief of Staff H.R. Haldeman speaking on June 23, 1972. June 23rd? Well, that was a good bit after Watergate, right? Oh no. Only 6 days after the break-in. Their conversation concerned using the CIA to interfere with the FBI's investigation of, quote, Watergate-related money. For literal years, the question had been what Nixon knew and when he knew it. If he didn't know about Watergate for a long time, maybe it's not his problem. But now, the public had evidence showing that Nixon was not in the dark during the early cover-up. He knew the entire time. Nixon's political support collapsed. The House Judiciary Committee approved articles of impeachment, including obstruction of justice, abuse of power, and contempt of Congress. Impeachment, as we know from our recent episode about Andrew Johnson, is not itself removal. If you're impeached, it doesn't automatically mean you leave the White House. The House brings the charges of impeachment, and the Senate decides whether to convict and remove. But Nixon didn't even have his own party's support. Republican congressional leaders eventually told Nixon that the numbers just weren't possible. Even people he depended on, members of his own party that he trusted, were giving up on his chances. And on August 8th, 1974, Nixon made the now famous televised address.
Therefore, I shall resign the presidency effective at noon tomorrow. Vice President Ford will be sworn in as president at that hour in this office.
Nixon announced that he was resigning the presidency. He became the first and remains the only American president to ever resign from office. Gerald Ford then took his place. But even that transition was unusual because Nixon did not run with Gerald Ford in the 1972 election. Nixon's original vice president, Spiro Agnew, had resigned in a completely separate corruption case connected to his political career in Maryland. Nixon then nominated Ford under the 25th Amendment, and Congress confirmed him. Ford therefore became president without ever have been elected nationally as vice president or president. If you want the rest of his story, check out my other Season 4 episode, number 38, Who Are You?, my Gerald Ford episode. When Ford became the president, he told Americans that our long national nightmare is over. Okay, our long national nightmare, finally, we can breathe. Thank goodness Watergate will never come up ever again. Literally 1 month later, he presidentially pardoned Nixon for all federal crimes he may have committed as president. Ford said he wanted America to move beyond Watergate. The decision to pardon Nixon raised immediate questions about whether he should face legal consequences or not, because other figures affiliated with Watergate were convicted, and some went to prison. But did the Watergate scandal affect anything positively? Yes. The scandal drove reforms involving campaign finances, ethics, transparency in government, and oversight. And Americans began asking deeper questions about political money, re-election campaigns, presidential power, and most importantly, honesty. That reform mindset helped shape the 1976 election, when Jimmy Carter promised a more open and trustworthy government, and eventually won that election, beating Gerald Ford. But what else did Watergate do that we can see today? What if I told you that Watergate changed the English language? Ever since the scandal, people have attached gate to the end of almost every imaginable scandal, even when the controversy has little to no resemblance to Watergate at all. Some of my favorites are Toiletgate, Sharpiegate, Deflategate, and even Pizzagate. And whether we're talking about footballs, commodes, or Italian dishes, those events alone tell you how deeply this event entered American culture. And there's one final thread in the Watergate story that we need to tie together. For decades, people wondered about one mysterious element about the Watergate scandal. Woodward would have never had enough evidence to work against Nixon without this anonymous figure named Deep Throat. Nobody knew who he was, and people thought he would be hidden in the records of history, never to be found. But in 2005, 30 years after the conclusion of Watergate, former senior FBI official Mark Felt publicly emerged as the secret source who had guided and confirmed information for Woodward during the early investigation. One of Watergate's last great mysteries finally put a name to an anonymous face. In the end, Watergate was never simply about 5 men breaking into an office. It was about what happened when protecting political power, and when protecting an image became more important than confronting the truth. All the way back in 1960, Nixon figured out how important his image truly was, and he did everything to keep it spotless. No matter what Nixon did, reporters kept asking questions. Investigators followed evidence. Congress used its authority. Courts enforced limits. The ideas of checks and balances in our Constitution were put in the spotlight. Members of Nixon's own party eventually stopped defending a president they could no longer defend. Those checks and balances woven into the Constitution were tested in real time. Watergate started with something almost laughably small. Tape on a door, noticed by a security guard just doing his job. That simple mistake exposed a political operation. The operation exposed a cover-up. The cover-up exposed abuses of power, and the scandal forced Americans to confront a fundamental question. Can the President of the United States be held accountable? The answer was yes. And that is why the Watergate scandal is so important. Tune in next Friday as we talk about leadership in action. For the third to last episode on the main Presidents Unplugged series, it's an exciting one, where we're looking at some of the stories from Doris Kearns Goodwin's Pulitzer Prize-winning novel, Leadership in Turbulent Times, looking at leadership through the eyes of our United States presidents. 4 stories of 4 great leaders who have all made a significant impact in the American story. Learn about that and much more next week on Presidents Unplugged. I'm Ty Svensson, and I'll see you soon. God bless. Thank you for listening to Presidents Unplugged. If you enjoy content like this, give us a follow on Apple Podcasts or Spotify today to be notified that your favorite presidential podcast has released new content. Now, when do we release new content? Once a month, maybe twice a year, maybe even once a year? No. We release new content every Friday at 1 p.m. for my American enthusiasts to enjoy. Come join me on our dive into making American history the most entertaining and interesting subject to learn every single week. I'm Ty Svensson, this is Presidents Unplugged, and I'll see you soon.